As a kid, one of my favorite games to play was hide and seek. Many of you have heard of this game. If maybe you played it yourself. If you've never played hide and seek, it's never too late. Okay? It's never too late for a round of hide and seek. What a great game that was. One person, as you know, is designated to be the it person. So this person is we're going to agree on a home base that this person is going to close their eyes and count while everybody else runs and hides. And at the end of that counting, the thing I remember the most is the person who was it, they would say what? Ready or not, here I come. Right? Ready or not, here I come. I'm coming to find those who are hiding and try and tag them before they can reach home base. The thing that I remember about that mantra, if you would, ready or not, here I come, it reminds me of how many people actually roll, many believers, it's how they roll in ministry. Ready or not, here I come. It doesn't matter if I'm ready. This is my mantra. Ready or not, here I come. It doesn't matter if I've heard from the Lord. It doesn't matter if God has made it clear that this is what he wants me to do. Ready or not, here I come. This is how a lot of people roll. As we're going to see today, many times these are very good people with nothing but the best intentions, and they are very eager to serve the Lord. Their heart's in the right place, their mind's in the right place, all of that. But the question is, are they ready? Their approach is, ready or not, I'm coming. And because of those things, they assume that they are ready for whatever they are bursting to do for the king. How can I not be? Right? Remember we saw this earlier in 2 Samuel with David. Best intentions. He's looking at how he's living. He's looking at the conditions for the ark. And what does he say? I got to build God a house. Nathan says, yeah, sounds great. Makes sense to me. Ready or not, here we come. And that very night, God comes to Nathan the prophet and says, no, this is not what I want. But this is how many people roll. Ready or not, here they come. This is what we are introduced to in the aftermath of the death of Absalom, which ended the war in 2 Samuel 18 here. From there, the focus shifts from that to who is going to deliver the news to the king who's waiting to hear what happened on the battlefield. That's where we are. That's what we're stepping into. And so as we look at that, as we look at who's going to deliver the news to the king, and then as we look at the king's reaction to the news, that brings us this morning to take a look at prudent leadership. This is what we need to see, prudent leadership. When we're talking about prudent leadership, let me just give you a foundation for what we're talking about this morning. Prudent leaders are careful and mindful of the future. Prudent leaders are careful and mindful of the future. So prudent leaders, they are not rash in thinking, which means they are not rash in decision making. They're not. Nor are they short-sighted in perspective. They're not just looking at the here and now with respect to this decision. They're thinking ahead, they're looking ahead, they're thinking about the impact of this decision long term. They're prudent, very wise. We begin in verse 19. Then said Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, let me now run and bear the king tidings, how that the Lord hath avenged him of his enemies. So here's a man who is ready to go. He's ready to run. He's ready to go and do it right now. Let me go and tell the king what happened. He's ready, bursting. Let me now run. And Joab said unto him, Thou shalt not bear tidings this day, but thou shalt bear tidings another day. But this day thou shalt not bear tidings, because the king's son is dead. Very critical point. Then said Joab to Cushai, Go tell the king what thou hast seen. Crucial point. And Cushai bowed himself unto Joab and ran. Then said Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, yet again to Joab, But howsoever, let me, I pray thee, also run after Cushai. And Joab said, Wherefore wilt thou run, my son, seeing that thou hast no tidings ready? But howsoever, said he, Let me run. And he said unto him, Run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and overran Cushai. Think Ahimaaz was bursting to do something? Think Ahimaaz was ready to go? Ready or not, here I come. Yeah, he was. He was the son of Zadok the priest. You might remember that he was employed back in chapter 15 as part of David's intelligence team that would bring word back to him or keep him abreast of what was happening in Jerusalem. So this is who we're dealing with here. So along with Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, they were a part of that team. And from everything that we've seen with respect to his testimony, he was a faithful man. David himself even said in verse 27 that Ahimaaz was a good man. So here's a man who was faithful. Here's a man who was good. Here's a man who had nothing but the best intentions. This is who we're looking at here. Here's a man who was ready to go and help the king, keep the king updated. He had risked his own life in the service of the king, and he knew firsthand all that the king had gone through. He knew all that Absalom had put him through. He knew all about this wilderness experience, and he could not wait to get in front of the king and say, hey, it's over. God has avenged you of your enemies. Everything is good. Now, he expressed, as we saw, this eagerness to do this to Joab, who, in my humble opinion, whenever I'm reading about Joab, I'm always looking for the ulterior motive. Where is it? What's Joab's angle here? What's he angling for? What's he trying to accomplish? What's the backdoor thing here going on with Joab? Which could have been the case here, but in Joab's defense, he was prudent. He was prudent in pointing out to Ahimaaz that the king would not perceive this news as tidings, good news. He wouldn't perceive it that way. Why? Because his son was dead. That's why. So with the best intentions, Ahimaaz was actually eager to run to the king and deliver bad news, not tidings. This is what he was actually looking to do, again, with the best intentions. So listen, please, this is very, very important. When we're talking about prudent leadership, we're talking about prudent leaders. They are sensitive to timing in speech. They are sensitive to timing in speech. Very sensitive. The king was anxiously waiting for news and needed to be updated on how things went on the battlefield, listen, especially as it pertained to who? Absalom. Absalom. But one of the reasons it was not the right time for Ahimaaz to deliver the news was because, listen, it did not appear that he had all of the information. Eager, best intentions, willing, let me run. I mean, he is determined. He's pestering Joab, let me go, let me go, let me go. I mean, that's all good, except he clearly did not have all the data. He didn't. 2 Samuel 18:21, look at it. Then said Joab to Cushai, go and tell the king what thou hast seen. Cushai was a witness to what happened. That's important. When Ahimaaz eventually stands before the king, it will become very clear that he was not a witness to the most critical aspect of the battle, which was what happened to my son. Is he safe? Is he safe? One of the elements of our society today is that people are so anxious. They are so anxious to be the first one to report something. They are so anxious that they can't wait to click send. They can't wait to put it out there, even if it's not totally accurate. But at least I was the first one to report it. I just can't wait. I don't have all the facts. I don't have all the data. I don't have all the information, but at least I got there first. And unfortunately, the same thing happens in the church all too often. Listen, it's been some years ago, but I had a believer come to me once, and they reported something to me about another believer that was so dark and so egregious, that it was incredible. That had I ran with that initial report, we're talking about something that, if it was true, could have landed this believer behind bars. It did not sound like the person that I knew. It did not match their testimony. So I began asking a series of probing questions and to make sure that this is who we're talking about and this is what we're talking about and how do you know this for certain? And the more I pressed, the more it became clear to me that this person really wasn't certain. And sure enough, over time, the report turned out to be false. Timing in speech is important. We have to be careful. I tremble at the thought that I would have done had I ran with that report initially. I tremble. I tremble. Proverbs 25, verse 11 says, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pictures of silver. Apples of gold, pictures of silver seem to refer to a beautiful picture or a sculpted piece of art of gold, made of gold and silver, that is appreciated and beautiful to behold. That's what a word fitly spoken is like. It's an appropriate word. It's a word that's spoken at the appropriate time, and it is a word that is much appreciated. That's a word fitly spoken. But we live in a world, and unfortunately so many times in the church, where people, listen, are swift to speak and slow to hear. Like, we just can't hold this thing. Like, I've got to say it. I've got to tell this thing, even though I don't have all the facts, but I can't imagine that Ahimaaz was unaware of the king's instructions to deal gently with Absalom. So if he was to deliver the news to the king about the battle, would it not have been prudent for him to gather as much information about that as possible? Especially given the fact that he did not witness what actually happened. at least according to him. I'll tell you a verse that has come to mean a great deal to me. All of God's word means a great deal to me, but just practically speaking, as it pertains to marriage and as it pertains to ministry, this verse has come to mean a great deal to me. Proverbs 18:13, he that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it is folly and shame unto him. Boy, if we would just agree with God there. One of the things that causes conflict to escalate in marriage is this right here. It's this thing right here. It's answering a matter before we've actually heard or gathered all the information that we need to gather. And so what happens is this happens in marriage all the time, unfortunately, but spouses, particularly in times of conflict, spouses become omniscient. They become omniscient. So they know why their spouse said what they said and why they did what they did, instead of seeking to listen and understand. Instead, I know exactly why you did that and why you said that, and this is why you always do this, and this is why you haven't asked one question. All you've done is you've rushed to accusations and conclusions without having any information. Can I tell you, to my discredit and to my shame, like this verse says, there have been times in my marriage where I have landed flat on my face because I rushed to an accusation, I rushed to a conclusion without asking one question. And when the dust cleared and I finally got to a place where we could actually have a healthy, profitable discussion about whatever this thing was, and I actually got to hear from her and be properly informed about what she was thinking at the moment and what she meant and what she didn't mean. Oh, how stupid was I? Very. This happens all the time in marriage and in ministry. Someone once said, there is a special snare of the self-important. This thing right here. It's rushing to conclusions without hearing the matter. That's a snare for the self-important, because they are omniscient, right? They don't have to ask questions. They don't have to listen. They just have to be heard. Very dangerous. Listen, I don't care who you're talking to, who you're dealing with, be marriage or ministry. Anytime you are functioning from the perspective that you are more interested in being heard than you are listening, you have positioned that conversation to fail. You have to be as interested in listening than you are being heard. Very practical. But how often we run that stop sign. Knowing when to speak, listen, is as important as knowing what to say. Timing. I'm so grateful to have had experiences where I've been in rooms with men that I respect and admire. I've been in situations where I'm in a meeting and there'll be men in the room, and there are certain men over the years I've just come to go, okay, because I study leaders, because I need to learn. I want to learn, right? I want to learn what to do, what not to do, all that. But some of the men I've really come to treasure and respect, men who are ahead of me, that will be in situations where, especially you get a group of pastors together, and you know, pastors are flesh. And sometimes it's like you can't get a word in. That's okay. And there'll be a guy in the room and he's not saying much. And at a certain point, whenever he believes that it is appropriate, he will speak. And he'll say what needs to be said and be done. And I go, wow, man, that was gold. How long you been sitting on that? And that's it. Not long-winded, not just wise, at the right time, perfect, fitly spoken. So prudent leaders are sensitive to timing of speech, but listen, they're also sensitive to timing in service. This is very, very important. Look at verse 21 again. Then said Joab to Cushai, go tell the king what thou hast seen. And Cushai bowed himself unto Joab and ran. Then said Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, yet again to Joab, but howsoever, let me, I pray thee, also run after Cushai. And Joab said, wherefore wilt thou run, my son, seeing that thou hast no tidings ready? But howsoever, said he, let me run. And he said unto him, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and overran Cushai. Now, again, based on his track record, it is so very hard for me to believe that Joab did not have a motive here. It's hard for me to believe that he didn't have one. In terms of sending Cushai, right? He chose him, he selected him to be the guy to deliver this news. He wasn't the only one to have witnessed this. Remember, Joab had 10 armor bearers who knew exactly what happened because they actually finished Absalom off. It's very possible that Cushai was one of those. I don't know that for sure. The text doesn't tell us that. But it could be, and again, I'm being very, very careful here. I'm not, eisegesis? I'm not reading into the text. I'm just trying to give us something to think about in terms of why Joab may have chosen one of his guys, knowing that he had disobeyed a direct order from the king. So could it have been that maybe he sent Cushai to soften that, someone that he knew would be an advocate for him? Again, don't know that for sure. Just something to think about. Either way, he was chosen over Ahimaaz to take the news to the king, and unlike Ahimaaz, who persisted on going, Cushai never asked to go. Didn't. He was sent. I've shared with you in the past how one of the most devastating hours for me years ago on Long Island was believing that I was on the cusp of becoming the lead pastor of that local church that we were a part of, to those people that we loved and to this day love so very much. And I thought that was going to happen. We thought it was going to happen. And when that door shut, I mean, it devastated me. I mean, it shook the foundation that I stood on. Like Ahimaaz, I was bursting to do this. I wanted this so bad. I don't have words to capture how bad I wanted to do that. I believe that it was my time. I believe at the time I had earned it. I believe that I could do a better job in every way than the man who was doing it. I believe that I was a better teacher. I was a better leader. I had the hearts of the people. I believe the church was hungry for that the church wanted that. Can you now start to see why it didn't happen? Yes, praise God, exactly. Exactly. I had the most dangerous blind spot that a leader can have: pride. That is the most dangerous blind spot that a leader can have, and I had it. That led to another blind spot that I had that was and is very problematic in leadership, and it was this: I was not diplomatic. Dangerous. My approach at the time was to take a sledgehammer to every disagreement and every problem. You don't want to disagree with me. You don't want to challenge me. You are either with me or you are against me. That's how I led. Dealing with people tactfully in those situations was not something I knew how to do, nor was it something I was interested in doing. Someone has defined tact as the knack of making a point without making an enemy. For me, I couldn't make a point without making an enemy because I wasn't diplomatic. Disagreement to me at that season of my life meant that, okay, you've made a declaration of war against me and I'm going to win. I was so unfit and so unprepared, although I was bursting to do it, but I wasn't ready. And as we all grow in leadership, listen, being diplomatic is a necessary skill. It's necessary. You can't just ramrod things down people's throats and just say, this is how we're going to do it, and I don't care what you think about it. No, remember what we heard, what we saw earlier, Proverbs 18:13? Like, you've got to hear the matter. You've got to learn to appreciate the perspective that other people might have, that you don't have, that you need to be able to make the best decision. Diplomatic. And I'm so grateful how the Lord has used these last 14 and a half years to help me develop and grow under, in my opinion, the greatest pastor to have ever lived, named Sam Miles, where I've had a front row seat to learn these things. I could have learned it on Long Island, but I wasn't ready to learn it because I was so full of pride. And what God did and what God has done over these last 14 and a half years is bring me to the place where I'm not ready, nor do I desire anything that God says you're not ready for. So don't go chase anything, don't try. No. If God hasn't given it to me, then I'm not ready. It doesn't matter how much I want it. I wanted that pastorate so bad on Long Island, but God says, you're not ready, son. No. Please hear this. Prudent leaders respect that the Lord never rushes people to ministry roles that they are not ready for. And so that has been something that I've had to learn in my own walk, but it's also been something that God has had to teach me in terms of leading people. It's so exciting. You look at people and they've got potential, they've got zeal, they've got gifts and abilities. They're like ahamas, they're willing, and you're just like, oh my goodness, man, this person can do this, I can do that, and you're just ready to get them going, and that's great. But there have been times, to my discredit, where I've gotten ahead of the Lord. And the Lord's like, listen, you've got to slow down. You're moving too fast with them. Slow down. Pay attention to the signs, as Greg Axe would say. Pay attention to the signs. Ahamas got to stand before the king, and let's see what happened. Look at verse 28. And Ahamas called and said unto the king, all is well. And he fell down to the earth upon his face before the king, and said, blessed be the Lord thy God, which hath delivered up the men that lifted up their hand against my lord the king. Okay, that's tidings. Verse 29. And the king said, is the young man Absalom safe? And Ahamas answered, when Joab sent the king's servant, and me thy servant, I saw a great tumult, but I knew not what it was. And the king said unto him, turn aside and stand here. And he turned aside and stood still. So Ahimaaz, he overran Cushai, got to the king before Cushai did, and surprise, surprise, after telling the king that, hey, listen, God has avenged you of your enemies, they've been defeated. What was the first thing out of the king's mouth in verse 29? Is the young man, Absalom, safe? First question. And what was the answer? Essentially, I don't really know what happened, sir. I mean, again, he heard what the king said before they left. Make sure that Absalom's dealt with gently. Like, he knew this. And the king's response in verse 30 was, turn aside and stand here. In other words, step aside. You're of no help to me right now. You got here, but you're not ready. While Ahimaaz might not have witnessed what happened like Cushai did, Ahimaaz knew what Joab said in verse 20. And what was that? The king's son is dead. So at the end of the day, listen, sorry, but this is what comes with this. If you're standing before the king, you're gonna have to say the hard thing. Are you ready for that? I get it. Like in ministry, your people are bursting, especially in churches like this, where some guys in particular, they just covet this, what I'm doing right now, man. Give me a platform. No problem. Are you ready to handle what comes with that platform? Are you ready to sit down with people and say hard things? My goodness, if all this was just studying and preaching, yeah, I hear you. I really believe anybody could do it. But are you ready to stand in situations where, you've got to say some things that are so hard for people to hear? That's what this is. And he wasn't ready. Now, Cushai was asked the same question in verse 32, and notice his answer. And the king said unto Cushai, is the young man Absalom safe? And Cushai answered, the enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, be as that young man is. He's not safe, king. He's not safe. That was an honest and tactful delivery. That was the question that Ahimaaz needed to be able to answer. As hard as the question was. But he wasn't ready to do that. Timing and service was something that the Apostle Paul stressed with Timothy in the qualifications for the office of the pastor. Notice what he says in 1 Timothy 3, verse 6, not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride he fall into the condemnation of the devil. A pastor can't be a new convert. Doesn't matter how excited he is about it. Doesn't matter how, a guy just gets saved 6 months ago, stands up, gives a testimony that is just on fire, and man, God is all over this guy. I think he's a pastor. Reckless. I wish I was exaggerating, but those things have happened. Deacons can't be novices either. Look at verse 10 of 1 Timothy chapter 3. And let these also first be proved. Then let them use the office of a deacon, being found blameless. How do you prove someone for the office? It takes what? Time. You watch their walk. You watch their testimony. You watch them over time. I was talking to a dear brother recently, and he was saying, I love this guy, and he was saying, you know, man, it's been bumpy at times. Yeah, but that's necessary, isn't it? God uses that turbulence, doesn't he? God uses the turbulence to prove you. Like one of the things we always tell couples in premarital is that, listen, you got to look at it this way. You're getting on a plane and no one's wearing a parachute. It's going to get rough. There's going to be turbulence, but nobody's jumping. We're going to ride it out. No parachute. God uses that. You've got to watch people and just watch them. How do they deal with hard things? What do they do when the pressure gets turned up? Do they run and hide? Do they disappear? Or do they ride it out? To prove deacons takes time. Pastors too. Look at 1 Timothy 5:22. Lay hands suddenly on no man, neither be partaker of other men's sins. Keep thyself pure. The command here is, listen, don't ordain pastors or appoint deacons too quickly. Don't do that too quickly. I mean, I get it. You're excited. They got a lot of potential. That's great. But have you seen them in all the seasons of life? Right? Same counsel that I've given my children. And you're walking through the process of trying to discern whether or not this person is a candidate for marriage. Watch them. Watch them in all the 4 seasons of life. Listen, who doesn't love spring? Who doesn't love summer? I really, really like fall. I would take fall year round. But winter always comes, doesn't it? Amen. Have you watched them when it's 10 below with the wind chill? Have you watched them in that season? Have you? You might want to. Because if you marry them, that season is coming. Amen. Where it'll be minus 10 with the wind chill. That's the season you're in. And what you want to know is, well, how are they going to respond? Pay attention, they'll tell you. Time. So, brethren, with the Lord, when is always as important as what? Don't ever forget that. When is always as important as what? Finally, verse 24. And David sat between the 2 gates, and the watchman went up to the roof over the gate unto the wall, and lifted up his eyes, and looked, and behold, a man running alone. And the watchman cried and told the king, and the king said, if he be alone, there is tidings in his mouth. And he came apace and drew near. And the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called unto the porter and said, behold, another man running alone. And the king said, he also bringeth tidings. And the watchman said, methinketh the running of the foremost is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, he is a good man and cometh with tidings. So David knew that if he saw a group of men returning to Mahanaim, that meant that the men were in retreat and they had been defeated. But when he saw just, okay, there's a man running and then there's another man running, okay, that must be good news. I don't see a group. I don't see a large group of men returning in defeat. And what he wanted to hear was that not only had they won the battle, he knew that just by what was returning, but what he wanted to know was, okay, you won the battle and Absalom is safe, right? That's what he wanted, which led to one of, the most raw expressions of grief in God's word. Verse 33. And the king was much moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, thus he said, O my son Absalom, my son, Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. We should remember that David's response to Nathan the prophet, to the parable that Nathan spoke to him to unveil his sin. Remember what David said about the man who had stolen the lamb? That he should die, which went beyond what the law actually called for, but so he should be put to death, but he also needs to restore the lamb fourfold. Remember that? Well, here we are. This was the third son of David to die. And there would be a fourth with Adonijah later. 4. But here's where we're going in this final point. Absalom was not the only man to die in that battle, was he? Thousands of men died in that battle. 20,000 at least, which is to say that 20,000 families had been affected by this. 20,000 men did not return home. That's sober. Not to mention, with the death of Absalom and the defeat of his army, which God clearly did, David had a nation to get back to and lead. Stay with me, because this might sound insensitive, but listen. David needed to think and act like a king, not a father at this point. Do you hear that? He needed to think and act like a king, not a father. That's what the nation needed him to do. See, prudent leaders are sensitive to timing and sentiments. They're prudent to timing and sentiments. They have to be. They have to be. Ecclesiastes 3:4, you know it. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. This was not a time for David to weep and mourn. That wasn't the time for those sentiments. Again, that might sound hard, but that's the turf. This wasn't a time for that. It's not that David did not need to weep and mourn the loss of his son. It was that at this point he could not afford to be led by grief when he needed to lead the nation as king. You hear that? That was the issue. He could not be led by grief at this point. He had to lead the nation as their king. And David being led by grief was evident by what he said at the end of verse 33. He says, "Would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." While we can appreciate that sentiment, can we look at it objectively? Would it have been best for the kingdom for David to actually die for Absalom? No. That would not have been best for the kingdom. Had David died in Absalom's place, things would have gone from bad to worse, because Absalom was not the Lord's anointed, he was self-appointed. So he was not best for the nation. It would not have been best for David to die in place of Absalom. What would have happened to all those people who were with King David in the wilderness If David dies in place of Absalom, at a minimum, their lives were in grave danger. Thousands of them. What did this sentiment communicate to all those men who had risked their lives to join David in the wilderness and put themselves on the battlefield put their lives on the line? What did it communicate to all those men that the king wished that he died in Absalom's place? No, we put our lives on the line to defeat him for you, for your honor, in the best interests of the kingdom, and you're saying you wish that you died in his place? I'm sorry, what am I missing? As we'll see in chapter 19, David's grief left those men, you know what? Covered in guilt and shame. Instead of coming back, returning in valor and appreciation for loyalty and dedication and sacrifice, they're hanging their heads because, my goodness, the king is grieving over what happened to Absalom, over what we did, apparently. This was not a time to grieve, this was a time to lead. That's important. A movie that I've enjoyed very much, I've watched it a few times, you may have seen it, U-571. Anybody? Yep. U-571, outstanding movie, I highly recommend it, and I'll try not to spoil it for you, but Matthew McConaughey, many of you know him. He's a fine actor. He's a Texas fan. I don't like that, but he's a very good actor. He played the role of Lieutenant Andrew Tyler in the U.S. Navy, who thought, like Ahimaaz, he was ready for his own command. Like he wanted it bad. His lieutenant commander did not believe that he was ready, so he withheld his recommendation, to which Lieutenant Tyler really struggled with that. In a conversation between the two, Lieutenant Tyler expressed to his lieutenant commander that he would give his very life for every one of his men, which is admirable. Like, you want to hear that from a leader, that's a good thing, but I want you to hear the response of his commander. Listen, he said, "I know you would. I'm not questioning your bravery. The question is, what about their lives? You and Mr. Emmett are good friends. You went to the academy together. Would you be willing to sacrifice his life? Or what about some of the younger enlisted men? You know, a lot of those guys look up to you like a big brother. You willing to lay their lives on the line?" At that point, Lieutenant Tyler, you could tell he hadn't thought about these things and went into a place of deep reflection and processing. The commander went on to say, "You see, you hesitate, but as a captain, you can't. You have to act. If you don't, you put the entire crew at risk. Now that's the job. It's not a science. You have to be able to make hard decisions based on imperfect information, asking men to carry out orders that may result in their deaths. And if you're wrong, you suffer the consequences. If you're not prepared to make those decisions without pause, without reflection, then you've got no business being a submarine captain." End of discussion. Final point. Prudent leaders can bridle their emotions in critical moments and act soundly. That's the job. We're talking about impossible, difficult, uncomfortable situations where you've got to make a hard decision and you've got to take this out of it. You've got to set this aside. There'll be a time to deal with this. But for right now, you can't be led by grief. You got to lead. You've got to manage your emotions, your sentiments, your feelings. Does that make sense? That's what David had to do here. This is an issue that we're going to walk into in chapter 19 because his men were struggling with this. I would have too.